Imagine a corpse so toxic it can take its own photograph from inside a lead-lined coffin using only the radiation in its bones. In the 1920s, these factory workers were transformed into human isotopes, their very breath becoming a poisonous emerald mist that still haunts the ruins of Orange. Beware the glowing handprint. Once the shimmering specter touches your skin, the ticking in your bones never stops. In the year 1917, the air in Orange, New Jersey tasted of metallic promise and the sharp ozone tang of industrial progress. Inside the brick walls of the United States Radium Corporation, hundreds of young women sat in rows like porcelain dolls, arranged for a grand assembly. They were the chosen ones, the daughters of immigrants and laborers who had found a path to independence through the alchemy of the modern age. Each girl held a brush as thin as a whisker, ready to capture the very essence of the sun. The work was a delicate dance of repetition and grace, known as the lip, dip, paint technique. To keep the fine camel hair bristles sharp enough to trace the tiny numerals on watch dials, the girls were instructed to use their own mouths as tools. They pressed the brushes between their lips, moistening the fibers with saliva before dipping them into the pale, powdery pigment. It was a sweet, gritty substance that coated their tongues in a faint, starchy film, a nectar of industry that they swallowed without a second thought. This pigment was undark, a miracle of science distilled from the mysterious element discovered by the Curies just a few decades prior. To the girls, it was merely a beautiful curiosity, a substance that defied the natural laws of shadow and light. They watched as the jars of paint shimmered in the dim corners of the workshop, glowing with a soft, ethereal emerald hue that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It was as if they were bottling the spirits of the stars, unaware that the light was a cold, subatomic fire that would soon consume their very essence. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the factory floor transformed into a carnival of accidental magic. The girls, intoxicated by the novelty of their glowing workplace, began to use the leftover paint to decorate their own bodies for their evening festivities. They painted glowing swirls upon their collarbones and dusted their eyelids with the radioactive powder until they looked like celestial apparitions. Some even painted their teeth, flashing brilliant neon smiles at one another in the dark, laughing as their mouths became beacons of light that could be seen from across the street. But the light was not a superficial ornament. It was a hungry guest that had taken up residence deep within their bloodstreams. With every lick of the brush, thousands of microscopic particles of radium traveled down their throats, settling into their bones with a sinister permanence. The element was a chemical mimic, a ghost that disguised itself as calcium so the body would welcome it into the skeletal structure. Deep in the marrow of their hips and jaws, the radium began its eternal ticking, a countdown of destruction that would outlast the memory of their names. The girls felt like goddesses, walking home through the dusk while their clothing and skin emitted a ghostly, greenish aura. Passers-by would stop and stare at the shining girls, mesmerized by the strange luminescence that followed them like a trailing shroud. They were the talk of the town, symbols of a new era where human beings could transcend the darkness of the night. Even the dust they shook from their aprons at the end of the shift looked like fallen glitter, settling into the cracks of the floorboards to wait for its chance to feast on the living. By the time the year 1918 arrived, the novelty had begun to curdle into a silent, gnawing dread that no one dared to name. One girl noticed that her gums had turned a pale, sickly gray, bleeding at the slightest touch of a toothbrush. Another found that her ankles had grown strangely brittle, snapping under the weight of a simple walk to the grocery store. The beautiful glow was still there, shimmering through their skin at night, but it now looked less like starlight, and more like the phosphorescence of rotting wood in a damp, forgotten cellar. The first real casualty was a girl named Grace, whose jaw began to ache with a relentless, throbbing heat that felt like a localized sun trapped beneath her skin. When she visited the dentist, the tooth he extracted brought with it a jagged fragment of the bone itself, honeycombed and crumbling like ancient parchment. The hole in her gum refused to heal, remaining an open, weeping sore that smelled of old copper and decay. The light was finally breaking through the surface, no longer a decoration, but a hungry parasite that was eating the foundations of her face. As the health of the workers spiraled downward, the men in the mahogany offices watched the stock prices and the rising demand for luminous military equipment. They issued memoranda claiming the paint was perfectly safe, even beneficial for the Constitution, while they themselves handled the raw radium with lead-lined gloves and silver tongs. The girls were told they were suffering from hysteria or common ailments, their rotting jaws dismissed as the result of poor hygiene or secret sins. The corporate machine ground on, fueled by the sacrifice of the women. By the winter of 1920, the factory had become a mausoleum of the walking dead, though the girls still took their places at the benches. Their faces were bandaged, and their eyes were hollowed by constant agony. Yet they continued to lick the brushes, feeding the fire that was hollowing them out. The glow in the room was now a blinding, oppressive force, a sea of radioactive specters painting their own death sentences in silence. The era of the shining girls was coming to an end, as the starlight they had stolen turned their bodies into cold, glowing bone. The year 1922 dawned with a deceptive tranquility. But for the women of the factory, the silence was broken by the sound of their own bodies turning into glass. In the cold light of the morning, they would touch their faces and find that the skin felt tight, stretched over a skeleton that had begun to vibrate with an unseen internal energy. It was no longer a matter of glitter on the collarbone. The fire had retreated into the darkness of the marrow, where it began its slow, relentless banquet. The first signs were subtle, appearing as small, dark spots on the gums that refused to heal, regardless of the ointments applied. One young painter, whose name was Molly, felt a sudden, sharp crack as she bit into a piece of toast, followed by a rush of copper-tasting blood that would not stop. It was not the tooth that had failed, but the very socket that held it, which had dissolved into a spongy, glowing mass that resisted any attempt at medical intervention or suture. Within months, the clinics of New Jersey were flooded with women who shared the same terrifying symptoms of jaw necrosis. The doctors, baffled by the novelty of the condition, searched for names in their dusty textbooks, but the words they found were insufficient to describe the rot. They whispered of phosphorus poisoning or industrial fumes, yet none of these explanations accounted for the fact that the open wounds in the girls' mouths emitted a faint, ghostly green light when the lamps were extinguished. The dentist's chair became a site of inadvertent desecration, where pliers meant for healing became instruments of unintentional horror. When the practitioners reached into the mouths of the painters to remove a troublesome molar, the bone would frequently come away in jagged, luminous shards. There was no resistance from the skeletal structure, which had been rendered into something resembling calcified lace, brittle enough to be crushed between a thumb and a forefinger, like the shell of a dead beetle. A sickening, sweet odor began to follow the women wherever they went, a scent of ancient decay that no amount of floral perfume could fully mask. It was the smell of necrotic bone, a distinctive perfume of the grave that announced their presence before they even entered a room. Their colleagues at the factory would turn their heads away, not out of malice, but out of a primal, instinctive fear of the rot that was jumping from jaw to jaw like a silent, glowing plague that had no cure. By the middle of 1923, the physical changes were no longer hidden beneath high collars or layers of rouge. The lower faces of the girls began to sag and shift, the skin collapsing inward as the structural integrity of the mandible vanished. Some found that they could no longer speak without a rattling sound in their throats as pieces of their own skeletons broke off and settled in the soft tissues of their necks, becoming jagged internal stars that scratched at their vocal cords. The executives of the corporation viewed these developments from behind the safety of their lead-lined glass partitions, clutching their leather-bound ledgers. They hired specialists to examine the women, but these doctors were puppets on a string, paid to find any cause other than the miracle of radium. They wrote reports blaming the girls for their own agony, suggesting that the decay was the result of secret lives and moral failings, weaving a web of shame to keep the truth from leaking into the headlines. This corporate gaslighting was a second poison, one that eroded the girls' spirits even as the element eroded their bodies. They were told they were crazy, that their pain was a figment of their imagination, even as they held pieces of their own jawbones in their trembling palms. The isolation was absolute. For who would believe a group of factory girls over the word of a multi-million-dollar industry that claimed to be lighting the way for the future of all mankind? Deep within the bones of the sufferers, the radium was performing a gruesome miracle of physics that mocked the laws of nature. The alpha particles were like microscopic cannonballs, firing millions of rounds every second into the delicate lattice of the human frame. Each impact shattered a strand of genetic code or pulverized a mineral bridge, turning the sturdy architecture of the body into a pile of radioactive rubble that glowed with the intensity of 1,000 tiny, dying suns. The vanity mirrors that once reflected youthful beauty now revealed a landscape of skeletal devastation that no one could have predicted. The girls would sit in the dark and watch their own reflections, horrified to see that their very breath seemed to shimmer with a fine, luminous mist. Their eyes, once bright with ambition, were now clouded by the realization that they were being consumed from the inside out by a fire that required no oxygen and would not stop until they were nothing but ash. Some women found that their legs were the first to betray them, the femur snapping with the sound of a dry branch in a winter wind. They would fall in the middle of a grocery store or on the steps of a church, their bones failing to support even the slight weight of their diminished bodies. The radium had migrated from the mouth to the rest of the skeleton, turning every limb into a fragile, glowing liability that threatened to shatter with the slightest movement or pressure. The year 1924 brought the first wave of true casualties, as the infections in the mouth turned into systemic failures of the blood and heart. The girls died in agonizing silence, their bodies becoming so saturated with the element that they were dangerous to handle even after the pulse had ceased. The undertakers noticed that the corpses did not look like normal cadavers. They possessed a strange, unsettling radiance that seemed to push against the lid of the coffin like a trapped and restless spirit. It was discovered that a simple sheet of photographic paper, if placed beneath a deceased girl's hand for a few hours, would develop an image of her bones without the use of any external light. The skeleton was taking its own picture, projecting its own image from beyond the veil through the medium of the decaying flesh. This was the ultimate proof of their transformation. They had become the very thing they worked with, a human isotope that would remain active for centuries. The burial of the first few victims required a level of caution that had never been seen in the history of the local cemeteries. The earth was not enough to hold the light, and there were whispers that the graves would need to be lined with lead to prevent the soil from becoming a glowing, toxic mire. The family stood by in a state of numb, horrified shock, watching as their daughters were lowered into the ground in heavy metallic boxes that looked more like industrial vaults than resting places for the young. Even in death, the girls of Orange remained the source of morbid fascination for the scientific community, which began to realize the scale of the catastrophe. Some researchers wanted to exhume the bodies to study the rate of decay, while others feared that opening the coffins would release a cloud of glowing dust that would poison the entire county. The girls were no longer people, but data points in a terrifying experiment that had no control group and no possibility of a happy ending. As the chapter of their lives drew to a close, the survivors of the factory began to organize, their voices raspy and weak but filled with a new, incandescent rage. They realized that their only hope for justice lay in proving that the corporation had known of the danger while they were still licking the brushes. They were a sisterhood of the damned, bound together by the green light that pulsed in their veins and the knowledge that every second they spent speaking was a second stolen from a rapidly diminishing clock. The final days of the year 1925 saw the factory standing as a dark, silent monument to the industry that had betrayed its children. The windows were opaque with dust, but if one looked closely during the new moon, a faint shimmer could still be seen dancing along the workbenches. It was the residue of 1,000 lives, a thin layer of stardust that would never settle, waiting for the moment when the truth would finally burn through the layers of corporate lies and reach the cold, uncaring world outside. The rot was not merely physical, for it had seeped into the very soil and water of the town, creating a legacy of poison that would outlast the buildings and the people. The Radium Girls were the first sentinels of a new kind of horror, one that was invisible, odorless, and eternal. They were the pioneers of a nuclear nightmare, their bones serving as the foundation for a future where the light of progress would always be shadowed by the inevitable, glowing rot of those who had been sacrificed to create it. By the year 1927, the courtrooms of New Jersey were chilled by a presence that no heater could thaw. 5 women, dubbed the Radium Girls by a sensationalist press, arrived like a procession of the condemned, their skin as pale as alabaster, but for the strange, pulsing warmth that seemed to radiate from beneath their garments. They were seeking justice against the corporation that had turned their bodies into radioactive spent fuel, standing before a world that viewed them with a mixture of pity and superstitious dread. Grace Fryer, the leader of the Broken Sisterhood, had to be carried into the witness box, her spine having become a brittle column of salt and light. She could no longer hold her head high without the aid of a brace, for the vertebrae were collapsing into one another like a slow-motion car crash. Yet, when she spoke, her voice possessed an eerie, crystalline clarity that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards, a sound that originated not in her lungs, but in the very marrow of her disintegrating bones. The corporate defense was a masterpiece of cold, calculated delay, a strategy designed to wait for the plaintiffs to die before a verdict could be reached. Their lawyers argued with a mechanical precision, suggesting that the statute of limitations had expired since the girls had left the factory years prior. They spoke of the law as a rigid, unyielding stone, ignoring the fact that the poison inside the women was a living, breathing force that ignored the passage of time and the boundaries of legal precedents. Every day spent in the courtroom was a day of excruciating physical tax for the women, who watched the ticking clock on the wall with a frantic internal synchronization. They could feel the radium atoms exploding inside their joints, each tick of the second hand punctuated by a microscopic burst of heat that signaled the destruction of another cell. They were not merely fighting for a settlement. They were fighting to exist long enough to hear a judge acknowledge that their lives had been stolen for a dial. The scientific community was split by the payroll of the corporation, with paid experts testifying that radium was a tonic that invigorated the blood. They stood before the court, and claimed that the women's symptoms were a coincidence, a cluster of unrelated tragedies that had no connection to the sweet-tasting paint. It was a gaslighting of epic proportions, performed by men in white coats who knew that the very pens they used to sign their affidavits were potentially more dangerous than the women. To prove their case, the girls had to undergo examinations that felt more like autopsies performed on the living. Doctors pressed their thumbs into the softened bone of their jaws, documenting the way the tissue gave way like wet sponge. They measured the breath of the women with specialized instruments, finding that every exhale was a cloud of radon gas, a radioactive sigh that proved they were becoming biological reactors. They were no longer human beings, but contaminated evidence that needed to be cataloged. The media devoured the spectacle, printing photographs of the Society of the Living Dead that chilled the hearts of the public. People read about the girls who could light a room by simply standing in it, and a strange, voyeuristic horror took hold of the nation. Some sent letters of support, while others treated the survivors like lepers, crossing the street to avoid the invisible aura of death that they believed might jump from the girls to their own healthy, unsuspecting children. One by one, the girls' families began to collapse under the weight of the medical bills and the social stigma. Husbands left wives whose jaws had become weeping, luminous craters, unable to bear the sight of the woman they loved turning into a mechanical ruin. The homes that had once been filled with laughter were now silent, save for the sound of the girls' labored breathing and the rhythmic, terrifying ticking of the watches that they still kept, perhaps as a reminder of the time they had sold. In the year 1928, a settlement was finally reached, but it was a pittance compared to the magnitude of the suffering. Each girl received a small sum and a modest pension, enough to pay for their own funerals and perhaps a lead-lined casket to protect the earth from their remains. It was a victory of sorts, but it tasted like the copper in their mouths, a bitter and hollow conclusion to a battle that had already been lost the moment they first touched a brush to their tongues. The physical transformation reached its final, most grotesque stage as the radium began to fuse their bones together in a process of architectural cannibalism. Their joints locked into place, turning their bodies into rigid, calcified statues that glowed with an unearthly intensity in the dead of night. They could no longer swallow solid food, existing on a diet of liquids that tasted like ash, waiting for the final, inevitable collapse of their internal organs as the radiation reached systemic failure. The graveyards of orange began to glow with a soft, subterranean light as the first of the plaintiffs were finally laid to rest. The cemetery caretakers whispered of the grass that remained green even in the harshest winter, fueled by the heat radiating from the leaden vaults beneath the soil. It was a garden of the damned, a place where the earth itself had been rewritten by the greed of men and the power of a single, luminous element that refused to be buried or forgotten by the passage of time. Even as the legal battle faded from the headlines, the legacy of the Radium Girls began to change the laws of the land. Their sacrifice forced the creation of new safety standards and the recognition of industrial diseases, a hard-won victory for the generations of workers who would follow in their footsteps. But for the girls themselves, these changes were merely ghosts of a future they would never see, a legacy built on a foundation of rotting bone and shimmering, radioactive dust. The survivors found themselves trapped in a limbo between life and the light, their bodies becoming so thin and translucent that they seemed made of parchment. They could see the glow of their own hearts through their ribs, a rhythmic, pulsing emerald that beat with a desperate, fading strength. They were the first humans to see their own inner workings without the aid of a machine, a terrifying privilege that came at the cost of every tomorrow they had ever dreamed of possessing. As the decade drew to a close in 1929, the last of the original 5 plaintiffs sat in her darkened room, watching the stars through the window. She realized that the light in the sky and the light in her own marrow were one and the same, a cold and ancient fire that did not care for the plight of mortals. She was a daughter of the sun, a creature of the atomic age, and as she closed her eyes for the last time, she felt herself dissolving into the shimmering void. The factory stood empty now, a hollowed shell that the townspeople avoided as if it were haunted by more than just memories. The machines were silent, but the air remained thick with the invisible residue of 1,000 painted dials, a fine powder that settled on the lungs of anyone who dared to break the seal. The silence was absolute, yet if one listened with a heart tuned to the frequency of the damned, they could still hear the faint, rhythmic scratching of brushes against glass. The story of the Radium Girls became a fable, whispered in the shadows of the industrial age, a cautionary tale of the price of progress. But the true horror was not in the distant past. It was in the 1,600-year half-life of the element that still ticked in the soil of New Jersey. The girls were not gone. They were merely waiting, their spirits bound to the atoms that continued to fire their tiny golden cannonballs into the dark, a luminous choir that would never be silenced. Their specters began to manifest in the ruins of the factory, not as figures of flesh and blood, but as flickering, radioactive silhouettes that mimicked the work they had done in life. They could be seen leaning over spectral workbenches, their translucent fingers moving with a grace that they had lost in their final, painful years. They were a vision of a world where humanity was merely a temporary vessel for the power of the universe, a brief moment before being consumed by the light. To touch the shadow of a radium girl was to invite the fire into one's own skin. For the ghosts were not made of memory, but of active, unyielding particles. They left glowing, cancerous handprints on the walls and the floorboards, a trail of beautiful destruction that marked their passage through the physical world. They were the guardians of a secret that the official history books preferred to keep silent, a truth that pulsed with the inevitability of dread and beauty. The factory sat as a hollowed ribcage of industrial hubris throughout the 1950s, its brick facade weathering into a dark, bruised red. Its windows were like cataract-clouded eyes, watching the world move on from the tragedy of the 1920s with an indifferent, stony silence. Inside, the dust settled in thick, emerald-flecked blankets over the wooden benches where the girls had once labored. The air was heavy, not with the smell of old wood, but with the sharp, acidic tang of an element that refused to decay, pulsing with a low-frequency hum. Outside the crumbling walls, the town of Orange continued to expand, unaware that the foundation of its progress was built upon a glowing, toxic secret. Children played near the perimeter fences, fascinated by the way the weeds grew in strange, distorted spirals that shimmered under the pale light of the moon. They told stories of the ghosts that lived within the shadows, girls with missing faces who danced in the rafters, their laughter sounding like the dry, rhythmic ticking of 1,000 clock gears echoing through the hollowed-out basement. As the 1960s arrived, the memory of the Radium Girls began to fade into the realm of local folklore and hushed grandmotherly warnings. The corporation had long since vanished, leaving behind a poisoned legacy that the official records tried to bury under layers of bureaucratic ink. Yet, the ground itself refused to forget, and the local cemetery became a site of morbid curiosity for those who noticed the grass above certain plots never withered. Even in the deepest frost, the earth there remained unnervingly warm to the touch. By the year 1975, the site was a skeletal ruin, a jagged tooth of industry protruding from the landscape. The federal government finally sent men in thick, yellow pressurized suits to measure the invisible fire that still burned within the soil. They walked the perimeter with sensors that wailed in a frantic mechanical panic, discovering that the very bricks of the factory had become radioactive sponges. The building was no longer a structure of stone and mortar, but a massive, stationary battery of lethal and eternal energy. The investigators found that the contamination had migrated through the groundwater, creating a subterranean plume of light that stretched toward the nearby residential streets. In the basements of nearby homes, photographic film would spontaneously develop, revealing ghostly, fogged images of the foundations. It was as if the spirits of the factory were reaching out from the earth, trying to communicate their agony through the medium of the very radiation that had claimed their lives so many decades before. In the year 1984, an attempt was made to demolish the most dangerous sections of the facility, but the work was plagued by inexplicable accidents. Heavy machinery would stall without cause, and workers reported a feeling of intense, localized heat that seemed to emanate from the shadows. One foreman claimed to have seen a glowing figure standing in the center of the debris, her hand raised as if to paint the air itself with a brush made of pure, blinding emerald light. The demolition was halted indefinitely. The turn of the millennium brought a new kind of intruder to the gates of the Forbidden Zone. The urban explorer, seeking the thrill of the macabre. They came armed with cameras and handheld counters, drawn by the legend of the girls who glowed in the dark. These visitors treated the site like a haunted playground, unaware that the air they breathed was saturated with the pulverized remains of human bones. Every step they took kicked up a fine, luminous dust that settled deep within their lungs, waiting to begin its work. One such explorer, a man obsessed with the hidden history of New Jersey, crossed the rusted threshold in the year 2005. He carried a high-sensitivity Geiger counter that began to hum with a steady, rhythmic pulse the moment he entered the main workshop. The sound was unnervingly similar to a heartbeat, a mechanical throb that accelerated as he moved toward the center of the room. He felt a sudden, metallic sweetness on his tongue, a taste that reminded him of old coins and wet, stagnant earth. The beam of his flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating a workspace that looked as though it had been abandoned only yesterday. Racks of watch dials still sat on the benches, their numbers glowing with a faint, sickly luminescence that required no external power source. As he leaned closer, he realized that the glow was not coming from the paint alone, but from the very wood of the tables. The radium had leached into the grain, turning the furniture into a permanent monument to the industry of death. He noticed a series of dark, smudge-like shapes on the walls, positioned exactly where a person would lean while working. They were silhouettes of women, but they were not painted. They were photographic shadows etched into the plaster by decades of radioactive bombardment. These were the permanent imprints of the girls' bodies, captured in a moment of eternal labor. They looked like negatives of a forgotten photograph, their edges blurred and flickering as if the figures were trying to peel themselves away from the masonry. The explorer's breathing became ragged, and he felt a strange, vibrating warmth in his own jaw, a sympathetic ache that seemed to mirror the suffering of the women who had stood there. He turned to leave, but the air in the room had grown thick and heavy, as if the oxygen had been replaced by a dense, invisible fluid. The clicking of his counter reached a fever pitch, becoming a single, continuous scream of warning that echoed off the high, vaulted ceilings of the ruined factory floor. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement in the rafters. a flickering, translucent shape that descended with the weightless grace of a falling leaf. It was a girl, her form composed of swirling radioactive dust that shimmered with every hue of a dying sun. She had no face, only a glowing void where her jaw should have been, and her eyes were twin pits of emerald fire. She did not walk so much as glide, her presence accompanied by the faint, unmistakable scent of ozone and ancient, rotting flowers. The specter reached out a hand, her fingers elongated and shimmering like needles of light. As she approached, the explorer felt the hair on his arms stand up, and his skin began to tingle with 1,000 invisible needles. He tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the sudden, oppressive silence that filled the room. The girl touched the sleeve of his jacket, and where her fingers met the fabric, a brilliant, glowing handprint appeared, burning through the material to the flesh beneath. He collapsed to his knees, his vision swimming with a kaleidoscope of fractals and shimmering geometric shapes. He could see the silhouettes on the walls beginning to move, their translucent hands reaching out from the plaster to join their sister in the center of the room. They were a choir of the damned, their voiceless songs vibrating through his very skeleton. He realized then that they were not ghosts in the traditional sense, but sentient manifestations of the energy that had been stolen from the earth and trapped in human form. The explorer felt his own pulse begin to synchronize with the ticking of the phantom watches, a rhythmic thud that resonated in his teeth and bones. The light was no longer outside of him. It was pouring into his senses, rewriting his perception of the world into a landscape of pure, agonizing radiance. He watched in horror as his own hands began to emit a faint, greenish glow, the particles of the factory already beginning to colonize his marrow and claim him as a new member of their eternal, luminous sisterhood. As he crawled toward the exit, the ghosts of the factory watched him with an indifferent, celestial hunger. They did not seek to harm him out of malice, but out of a desperate atomic need to share the fire that consumed them. They were the daughters of the sun, and they were lonely in their 1,600-year vigil. The explorer finally burst through the doors and into the night air, but the darkness offered no refuge. He carried the factory inside him now, a glowing, cancerous passenger that would never let him sleep in peace again. Back in the safety of the city, he looked at his reflection in a storefront window and saw the first flicker of the light behind his own pupils. The handprint on his arm was a permanent brand, a shimmering mark of his intrusion into the realm of the eternal rod. He knew that his time was now measured in half-lives rather than years, and that the decay would soon begin its slow, rhythmic march through his jaw and his spine. He was the newest dial in the factory's collection, waiting for his turn to glow. The story of the factory in orange was no longer a matter of history or folklore for the man who had seen the truth. It was a living, breathing reality that pulsed in his veins every time his heart beat against his ribs. He realized that the world was full of such places, pockets of industrial nightmare where the ghosts of the past were still working, still painting, and still waiting for the light to finally go out. But the light of radium is a patient god, and it would be many centuries before the silence was truly absolute. He spent his final days writing down the names of the girls he had seen in the shadows, hoping to give them a voice before his own was stolen by the rot. But the words on the page seemed to shimmer and fade, the ink itself becoming radioactive under his touch. The light was jealous and did not wish to be described, it only wished to be felt. As he lay in the dark, watching his own skeleton glow through his skin, he understood that the transition was nearly complete, and he would soon return to the factory. The final image he saw before the light consumed his vision entirely was the factory floor as it had been in 1917. The girls were all there, their faces whole and their laughter bright, painting the dials of the world with the stolen fire of the stars. They looked at him and smiled, their teeth flashing with a brilliant neon promise that the pain was only a doorway. He stepped into the light, leaving behind a world of shadow, and became a flickering silhouette on the wall of the eternal workshop. The explorer returned to his apartment in the year 2005, carrying the silence of the factory within his very marrow. The city outside his window was a cacophony of sirens and neon, but inside his walls, a different kind of light was beginning to take root. He sat in the darkness of his kitchen, watching as the glowing handprint on his jacket began to bleed through the fabric and onto the skin of his forearm. A brand of emerald fire that refused to be washed away by soap or water. The sensation was not one of pain, but of a terrifying rhythmic vibration that seemed to match the ticking of a phantom watch. Every time his heart beat, the light in his arm pulsed with a synchronized intensity, casting long, distorted shadows across the linoleum floor. He reached for a glass of water, but his fingers felt strangely heavy, as if the bones had been replaced by solid bars of lead. The water tasted of copper and ozone, the same metallic nectar that had once sustained the girls of Orange. By the third night, his reflection in the bathroom mirror had become a stranger to him, a hollowed-out vessel for a celestial parasite. When he opened his mouth to scream, no sound emerged, only a fine, shimmering mist of radon gas that clouded the glass. His gums had turned the color of bruised plums, and a single molar fell into the sink with a sharp, crystalline ring, glowing like a discarded diamond. He realized that the factory had not merely marked him, it had begun to consume him from the inside out. The light was no longer confined to the handprint on his arm. It was spreading along his veins like a network of glowing roots seeking a subterranean water source. He could see the architecture of his own ribs through his shirt, a translucent cage that shimmered with every shallow breath he took. The air in the apartment had become thick and pressurized, vibrating with the collective whispers of 1,000 invisible women who had come to witness his transformation into a permanent monument of the atomic age. He attempted to call for help, but the telephone receiver felt like a searing iron against his ear, and the electronics in the room began to malfunction in his presence. Light bulbs flickered and died, unable to compete with the superior radiance that was pouring out of his own skin. He was becoming a biological reactor, a walking source of energy that defied the laws of the modern world. The shadow he cast on the wall was no longer his own, but the silhouette of a woman with a missing jaw, her hand raised in a silent motion. The ghosts of the factory began to manifest in the corners of his living room, their flickering forms emerging from the shadows like film developing in a dark room. They did not speak, for they had no mouths to form the words, but their presence was a heavy, suffocating pressure that filled the apartment. They moved with a synchronized mechanical grace, mimicking the lip-dip paint technique that had been their life and their death. Their fingers traced glowing lines in the air, weaving a web of radioactive lace. One of the specters drifted closer, her translucent skin revealing the shattered geometry of a skeleton that had been turned into a crystalline ruin. She reached out and touched his cheek, her fingers feeling like shards of dry ice that burned with an agonizing internal heat. He felt the structure of his own jaw begin to soften and buckle under her touch, the bone dissolving into a glowing slurry that tasted of sweet, industrial poison. The transformation was accelerating, driven by the proximity of the original sisters. The explorer realized that he was not the first to be reclaimed by the light, nor would he be the last. In the apartments above and below him, he could sense a similar, shimmering dread taking hold of the residents as the radiation he emitted seeped through the floorboards. The entire building was becoming a satellite of the factory, a new hive for the glowing rot to inhabit. The neighbors would wake up with phantom aches and luminous smiles, unaware that the countdown of their own half-lives had already begun in the dark. He staggered to the window, hoping to find solace in the mundane world of the street. But the city had transformed into a landscape of terrifying beauty. Every person walking below seemed to have a faint, emerald aura clinging to their heels, a residue of the factory that had been spread through the soil and the water for nearly a century. The radium girls had not stayed in their lead-lined graves. They had become the very atmosphere of New Jersey, a persistent subatomic ghost that was slowly bleaching the life out of the state. The pain in his spine intensified until it became a blinding white-hot cord that connected him to the earth itself. He could feel the movement of the radium atoms deep in the crust, the vast subterranean reservoirs of energy that were calling out to the fragments inside his own marrow. He was being pulled toward a collective consciousness, a hive mind of light that sought to erase the individuality of the flesh in favor of the eternal consistency of the isotope. His thoughts were becoming fragments of light and shadow. As the sun rose on the fourth day, the explorer could no longer move his limbs, his joints having fused into a single, rigid sculpture of calcified agony. He lay on the floorboards, a living statue that emitted a steady, unearthly glow that could be seen from the street through the closed curtains. His eyes were wide and fixed, the pupils having dissolved into twin galaxies of emerald fire that reflected the history of the factory in a never-ending loop of painting and dying, over and over, until the end of time. The ghosts gathered around him in a protective circle, their translucent forms pulsing in time with his failing heart. They were no longer terrifying to him. They were his only companions in a world that had abandoned them both. They stroked his hair with fingers that felt like static electricity, whispering silent promises of a peace that could only be found in the absolute stillness of the lead-lined vault. He was being prepared for his final role as a guardian of the secret, a new sentinel for the glowing cathedral. The apartment building began to hum with a low, resonant frequency that caused the glass in the windows to vibrate and crack. The neighbors, sensing a presence they could not define, fled into the night, their skin tingling with the invisible heat that was radiating from the explorer's room. They left behind their belongings and their memories, carrying only the spark of the rot within their bones, ensuring that the legacy of the factory would continue to spread through the arteries of the world like a shimmering, silent plague. The explorer felt his consciousness begin to detach from the ruin of his body, floating in a sea of radioactive brilliance that had no shore. He could see the factory in orange as it stood in the year 1917, a bustling hive of life and color that was yet to be touched by the shadow of the rot. He saw the girls laughing as they painted their teeth, their faces bright with a youthful innocence that broke his spectral heart. He wanted to scream a warning to them across the decades, but his voice was now only a click. The clicking of his Geiger counter, which had been his constant companion, finally slowed and stopped as the device succumbed to the very energy it was meant to measure. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise, a void of sound that allowed the whispers of the radium to become the only reality. The atoms were speaking to one another in a language of subatomic collisions, a cosmic symphony that celebrated the triumph of the element over the fragile, temporary vessel of the human being who had dared to hold it. His apartment was now a shrine to the luminescence, every surface coated in a fine, powdery residue that glowed with a desperate intensity. The books on the shelves, the clothes in the closet, and the very air in the room had become saturated with the essence of the radium girls. It was a photographic negative of a home, a place where the shadows were white and the light was a heavy, suffocating weight. The explorer was the center of this new world, a sun that had been born from the wreckage of a New Jersey industrial park. The ghosts of the factory began to merge with the architecture of the apartment, their silhouettes sinking into the walls and the ceiling, until the building itself seemed to possess a skeletal structure. The pipes in the walls rattled with the sound of phantom coughs, and the floorboards creaked under the weight of invisible footsteps that had been pacing for 80 years. The site was being reclaimed, transformed into a satellite of the original horror, a place where the past and the present were fused together by a green fire. In the final moments of his physical existence, the explorer felt a strange, ecstatic sense of belonging that washed over him like a tide of liquid gold. He was no longer a victim of a curse, but a vital part of a grand, glowing design that spanned the centuries. The pain was gone, replaced by a crystalline clarity that allowed him to see the world as a collection of interlocking energy fields. He saw the beauty in the decay, the way the radium was rewriting the story of the Earth in a language that would never be forgotten. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in days, he was not afraid of the dark. There was no more darkness, only varying degrees of radiance that shifted and pulsed with the rhythm of a universal heart. He felt himself being lifted by the hands of the girls, their translucent grip firm and certain as they guided him toward the threshold of the factory. He was leaving the world of the living behind, stepping into the shimmering void where the clock never stopped ticking and the light would never, ever go out in the dark. The city outside continued to breathe, unaware that a new star had been born in its midst, a flickering silhouette that would haunt the ruins of the apartment for 1,600 years. The story of the Radium Girls had found a new chapter, a modern echo of a tragedy that refused to stay buried in the lead-lined graves of the past. The light was patient, and as the explorer's body finally turned to glowing ash, the spirits of the factory began to prepare for the arrival of the next guest to cross their rusted threshold. The morning commuters passing the building would later report a strange, shimmering fog that clung to the brickwork, a mist that seemed to defy the wind and the warmth of the sun. They would complain of a metallic taste in their mouths and a sudden, inexplicable sense of dread that followed them to their offices. They were the unsuspecting carriers of the new dawn, the blind messengers of a light that was no longer confined to the ruins of a factory, but was now a part of the very fabric of their mundane lives.